Most of the plants in this area over here were put in ground this past year, so I tried to winter protect as many of them as I could. And most of them I used the black plastic cage that I showed before, wrapped around the plant and filled with some leaves if I had them, some dry leaves, and then covered with some sort of plastic, especially white plastic, to keep some of the heat off of it. So as the days get hotter, it doesn't wake the figs up too early. Some of them, when I didn't have time to do that, I covered them in a bucket, which then bucket or a old large pot, and I'm going to cover that in plastic in a little bit. Trying to get as many of these done as I can before we have the big snowstorm and the cold temperatures that we're going to have. The snow will be really helpful. The snow will, if we get 8 or 10 inches of it, it'll insulate the ground, it'll insulate the plants. We've got a couple nights coming up that are going to be 10 degrees. 10 degrees is kind of iffy on whether or not it's even worth covering these, but some of them are so young that I want to give them the best chance I have, covering them for at least the first year or so. Some of the bigger ones at 10 degrees should be fine, but when the forecast says 10 degrees, a lot of times it ends up being 7 or 8 degrees, and that gets more into the territory that will damage some of the above ground wood. In general with figs, I don't worry too much about it. If it's going to be 12 degrees or above, I don't even think I would do any of this to cover them. But once it gets below 12, different plants, different ages, and different amounts of lignification on the plant can get damage above ground. The roots should still be fine at those temperatures, but the better insulated you can get the roots, the better they're going to do. These are all insulated with a good layer of mulch that I put on in the fall, but the snow will be a big help too. The snow covering the roots and all that stuff will just keep it a little warmer and a little safer than it would be. This area here gets quite a bit of wind, as you might be able to hear right now, so any protection is just going to help. Some of these plastic wrap and the house wrap and the white contractor trash bags, as much as anything they do, they protect it from the wind. That and the leaves is just keeping the wind from blowing at a low temperature on these plants, just to keep them alive. Most of them won't die back to the ground at the 10 degree temperatures we're going to be getting, but when the forecast says 10, I never trust it. For this tree here, I just wanted to show some of my winter protection method. And with this one, it's going to start by cutting a plastic cage to fit around the tree. So I'm just going to start unrolling it. To secure a lot of my winter protection, I like to use these landscape staples. I use this on both the cage or the plastic cage and also the house wrap to hold it down so that the wind doesn't just blow it right away or blow it over and damage the plant. I also use this Tyvek tape to hold that all together, and these zip ties if I'm making the cages out of plastic. The plastic cage material is nice because it can be cut by scissors, so it takes less time. I put together metal cages sometimes too for some of the bigger ones because plastic won't hold up that big, but for the smaller ones, this is maybe 18-inch plastic fencing that I can cut just big enough so that I can fill it with leaves and then cover it. Now if this tree were thinner and not so thick, I could actually pull these in closer together so I can make a smaller cage and then maybe tie it with some rope or some kind of tie. But in this case, this is actually an older tree, even though it's short, so I have to cut it relatively short, and then I'm gonna have to make the cage a little bit bigger, like this. So this is a little less than, this is maybe a 16 or 18-inch wide cage. And for this one, I can just cut right here, right in a straight line. Okay, and then I can put this back. For these plastic cages, I've been using zip ties. Actually take it off to do it at that point. And I've been using zip ties I'm using 3 per cage, one at the top, one at the bottom, one in the middle, just to hold its shape a bit. Doesn't need to be perfect. The wrap that goes around it is going to give it some support too, and the leaves that go in it will keep it from flopping around. And then of course the ties at the bottom are going to help too. The landscape ties that I use to hold them all together. Right now I'm just little holes there on these guys. I'm just tying them together with these zip ties here. These are small zip ties. I believe these zip ties, this batch of them even came with this cage here, with the plastic fence material. I got 2 of them in, just one more. For these, I've been finding lately that doing the ties on the inside of the cage and then cutting them off when I wanted to might leave a little sharp piece, but it's going to be on the inside of the cage, so when I wrap it with the plastic, it won't cut it. So it works a little better. This plant here even has a little bit of rodent damage. Looks like a rabbit got to it, but it just got this one section here, so that's okay. This is a HSK unknown, which isn't a really good Adriatic that came as a seedling from California. See, even just the wind there will blow that right out of place. So I usually use 3 or 4 of these staples, garden staples, right here for each cage. I put them in some of the bottom pieces here, and just push them into the ground. Get this to hold its shape around it. Now with this plant, the whole thing doesn't have to survive. I just want a good amount of it to survive above the ground so that next year when it starts growing, it starts from a higher point than having to push buds, push new growth completely out of the ground. If I get some of this wood about 16, 18 inches up to survive, it'll help the plant get going a little quicker, and it'll have a form that I like. I like the way the trunks look as they get bigger over years of doing this, rather than just having them die back to the ground every year. Just one more should do it. Okay. All right. Now you see that mostly holds its shape. I can pull up on it a bit and it's not moving. So now when I go to fill it with leaves and wrap it with the plastic, it'll stay in place. For this part, I'm just trying to see how. I like to use the ugly branded side facing in and the pure white side facing out to reflect as much of the light off of this as I can. See, that wind makes this really difficult to do. So right now I'm just trying to measure how much of this I need. Okay. For this one, I can cut it here, and that should be enough. I'll move out of the wind a little bit to do this. Okay. And to hold it together, I use Tyvek tape, which they sell right next to this wrap. I usually get this wrap from Home Depot just because it's cheaper. Actual Tyvek wrap is insanely expensive. This stuff is something like $30 some for a 100, maybe 150 foot roll of it, at about this thick length, 3 feet long, about 150 feet. I think it's in the $30 some range, which is not great, but it's okay. If you can find something cheaper, go with that, because it just needs to wrap around it. Yesterday was much warmer and nicer doing this. Today it's in the 30s again. Yesterday it was almost 50 degrees, but tonight it's gonna be 10 degrees. That's why we're doing it. And I am securing the side where it opens up a little bit. I'm doing that opposite the wind because I find that if it can catch the wind, sometimes it rips all your stuff apart. I'm just gonna use the tape up to about the top of the cage. And for these, right now it's empty. I'm going to get a couple more landscape pins to hold that down. I'm gonna put these right in this landscaping, or the house wrap here, right in the bottom. Try and push them all the way in there so that it keeps this from pulling up. Because the real thing I want is I want it to be relatively wide at the base so that it holds a little bit of ground heat in. All right, now the next step is going to be to fill this with leaves. Okay, the next step here is going to be adding a bunch of dry leaves as insulation. You got to use dry leaves, especially if they're going to be in there a while. If they're only going to be in there for a couple weeks, you can use wet leaves. But if you're going to leave them in there for months and months at a time, you don't want any moisture inside, you don't want any dampness, or it can start to rot the fig branches. So I'm just going back to the cage that we were just doing. This is what it looks like on the inside here. And this can be metal or plastic, like I said, wrapped with the house wrap. And now I'm gonna work on the leaves. Start loading some dry leaves in here. Starting to fill up, and I'm just shaking around the leaves a little bit to get some of those air gaps out so there's not a big empty section. Full, I'll be able to wrap it. Now that it's filled up to the top, I'm gonna start wrapping this up nice and tight. I don't want there to be big loose sections because if it's loose, the wind can catch it and rip it off. So I'm kind of wrapping this like a Christmas package. I piled the leaves a bit higher on the inside so that hopefully there's enough material that when it rains on it, it'll roll off rather than pooling up. Because we got some snow and ice coming, and that water will sit in here and sink down and eventually leak into the thing. It's not so bad for me this year because I wrapped them much later than normal. And in the end, that's what it looks like. Looks like a nice big package. It's filled with dry leaves. Just gives a little bit of protection to everything. Keeps the wind off it. One of the main points I want to make is that you want the base to be wide. I've seen some photos and videos of people wrapping their figs and they just have just the stick coming out of ground and they're just wrapping the top branches. But what you risk with that is if the bottom is exposed or there's no protection around the very bottom part, it can just get too cold and it can die. And if it dies there, you're losing the whole tree to the ground anyway. So there's no point in wrapping the rest of it. The best protection you want to have is closer to the ground. And then it can get weaker as it gets up, because if the tree dies back to here or here, it's not as big of a deal as if it dies right at the base. It'll still come back out, you know, unless we get crazy cold this year or there's some other problem. But wrapping it up like that will help. Gives you a few degrees of protection. There's different wrapping methods depending on where you're located. This is for me in zone 7B here. Some winters we get as cold as 0. Most winters we get somewhere between about 5 and 15 degrees. This year so far we've had a 13-degree low. So every year is different, but this year so far we've had down to about 13 degrees. And that's okay. I wouldn't worry too much about wrapping things at 13 degrees or above. But once you get below that, tonight we're supposed to get down to about 10 degrees, and there's about 2 other days in the forecast where we're going to get down to 10 degrees according to the forecast. And usually when they forecast 10 degrees, there's a decent chance it can drop significantly lower, 8 degrees, 7 degrees, and a lot of those temperatures is where a lot of the smaller branches and sometimes even some of the bigger branches can take real damage from the cold. This area out here is very exposed to wind and just water, cold coming off the water over there, and it can get really cold and windy out here. So I wanted to make sure I protect as many of these as I can, just to give them the best chance to start off from the highest point possible next year. Now, I don't want them starting off growing from here, but anything knee height for a small tree is great, waist height for a bigger tree. Some of them I haven't even pruned yet, but I'm gonna get to most of them. They're almost all done. And some of the bigger trees, I just want to make sure I preserve that main trunk at the bottom. So the trunk can be, you know, 7, 8 inches thick, even thicker than that. And I don't want that to have damage on it, because once it starts to get cold damage on it, you're going to want to cut it off to remove as much of the cold damage as possible and then have it grow back from the ground. And I don't want to do that with any of my bigger trees. And the smaller ones, I don't want them to have to restart from the ground again. This is an example of one of my metal cages I use for some of the slightly bigger trees, not the first year trees. This is a 2nd or 3rd year tree. That's relatively thick. It's a bois de barricaire. And same thing with those landscape staples. I use those landscape pins to hold it in ground. This one here came out. This is supposed to hold the wrap material in the ground. This stuff works great around a metal cage too, but just the metal cages take longer to put together. If I only have a few, I would probably just do the metal cage. And then there you just buy some of this style roll fencing. You use clippers to cut it off the size you need. And I usually twist the ends together, then get pretty sharp. And then wrap it with the plastic. Use some tape to secure it. And then it looks pretty good in there. I'm just going to go about filling the rest of this with some dry leaves. The bigger the wrap, the more dry leaves you need, and that's usually the reason I don't go too big on the wrap. I had a bit more damage this year to some of the smaller trees from animals. I think this year it was rabbits, just based on where they are. And so far I haven't gotten hit on any of the trees that had some sort of protective cage around it, so I'll definitely recommend that to you if you can. Even on these small trees, if I had just wrapped a cage around it, 12, 18 inches around, they seem to go after parts of the wood, and they go for the buds sometimes. But they can do some real damage, and that's not great. The tree will recover and be fine, but they can really strip all of the outside off the tree and kill it right back to below where they were chewing on it. So the cages that I wrap around, I'm going to leave a lot of them in place, and a lot of times I leave them in place in the future. That's why I want some of the cages to be smaller, so all of the growth can be above the cage level, and I can cut back to the cage when I need to, and in the winter, to prevent things like that. So the rabbits can't get in there. Things like mice and voles can still get in there, but keeping the rabbits away is helpful. I also do a bit of a spray on a lot of the plants a couple times a year, especially in the winter, right in the beginning of the winter. I didn't get these early enough, but I sprayed them after that. This spray is basically mint oil, garlic oil, clove oil, mixed in a sprayer with a little bit of Castile soap, and I spray it on the plants, just kind of make them smell really strong, because a lot of the animals that like to chew on the bark don't like the strong smells and tastes. This is an example of another thing you can do. The cage I made was a little too short, so I just added a pot to the top of it, give it some stiffness, and then I'm going to wrap that again with some kind of fabric or the Contractor garbage bags. Here's an example of what I mean by Contractor garbage bags. They look just like the wrap. I turn them inside out because they've got like a logo on them, and they're like a nice woven fabric material. So these are actually from probably 2 years ago. They hold up for a while. And then they've got the leaves stuffed in them and then pinned down to keep it all warm. Not warm, but warmer than outside and less wind blowing on it. Traps a little bit of ground heat in. Another option that I've used on a few plants, where I'm just putting a large overturned pot on top of it, and that's it. So I cut it back to where it'll fit in the pot, sit the pot on top of it, and I'm going to wrap that in some kind of fabric or plastic or tarp material and pin that to the ground, just to keep a little bubble of air in there that is not as cold as the outside air. It won't do as much as being filled with leaves, but I don't have enough leaves to fill every one of these. But I got most of them, but some of them I'm just going to chance it and go with just the overturned bucket on top. Now I don't want to leave that black bucket there, because that black bucket will absorb a lot of heat from the sun on a sunny day, especially like yesterday where it was sunny and 50 degrees for a while. So I'm going to want to cover that in some kind of white fabric and something that there's a little bit of gap between the bucket and the ground. So I'm going to want something that seals it all the way to the ground. So it looks more like one of these guys that's filled with leaves. This is an example of some of the in-ground protection I'm using for some of the trees this year that are a little too big to fully wrap. Because they're too big to get everything in there, and our temperatures may not get low enough to actually kill all the wood back. I don't want to take my chance and just prune it all off. Instead, I'm wrapping the main part of it that I want to keep. So this tree has a main trunk, and then it splits into 2 or 3 other trunks, and I want to preserve that section. So I wrap that in the cages that I do and filled it with dry leaves and wrapped it with house wrap, and that should protect that section of the tree. If it gets cold enough, down to 5 or so degrees, I may experience some dieback in the part that's sticking out, but I'm okay to take that chance. If that happens, then in the spring I'll just prune it off. That one is a sea-legged dulce. This one is a Malta black here that I did similarly. I did this last year with the Desert King I had, and every bit of wood sticking out actually survived. So I may not have needed winter protection some years with some of these, but I'm just doing it to be safe so that I don't experience full dieback to the ground. This one here, some years I've cut them back to where they'll fit inside the protection that I use, and that's still probably the best way to go for some of the smaller trees. But as they get bigger, sometimes you don't want to cut them off too much. We don't get a ton of sun in this area, so that little bit of elevation I get from them starting at about 5 feet helps me get a little more light on these two. So I don't want to mess with that too much. So if it doesn't get cold enough to kill the tree back, I want to preserve those longer pieces there. But I do a range of different protections. A lot of them I have fully covered and protected by leaves, and then wrapped with either a Contractor white trash bag or a house wrap, and then the Tyvek tape. But you can try all different things as long as you create some separation to keep the wind off them and to keep just a little bit of insulation. You notice all of these have the base is as wide as I can get it, because that's one of the most important parts. That little bit of exposure to the ground brings a little extra heat in, protects it a little bit more, especially as you get down closer to the ground. That being wrapped in a cage and leaves, and then the wrap on the outside protects from the wind, and it just keeps it a couple degrees warmer than whatever it gets to outside, and that's the important part. This is just part of my fig storage that I have along the side of the house here. It's about 20 feet long, and it holds quite a few of my potted figs. That extra heat from being up against the house and then being wrapped into it, it's wood all around, and then I just have a tarp on the top. Keeps enough heat in that when it's 10 degrees outside, it'll probably be 20 degrees in there. And that's enough to help with most of the figs. You don't need to keep them warm, you just need to keep them from being ridiculously cold. And they're all piled in together, and that creates another bit of insulation, and the heat from the ground and the building is what does it for these guys. Some of my more important varieties get stored inside the greenhouse here. They get really piled up against one another, and there is a heater back there with a thermostat. That thermostat only kicks on once it gets below 30. So I'm not looking to keep these guys warm, but these are some of my more delicate ones, some of my more important ones, some of the ones that are going to need a head start in the spring, as well as some that I rooted way too late, so they're way too tender to be putting outside. So some that I rooted in maybe August, so they're still too green to be left outside to get down to 20 degrees. So I brought them in here just so that they're closer to the 30-degree range and above, and that should be fine. I also got a bay leaf plant over there. I got some pineapple guava here, and just some other things that are a little too sensitive. I just stack them in the greenhouse. I wrap the greenhouse in a tarp that keeps it from getting hot in here on purpose, and then I have a heater that kicks on when it gets below 30. This is an example of what I do sometimes with some of the container plants that don't need winter protection. There are varieties of plants that should be fine at these temperatures, but with any of them in a 1, 2, 3 gallon container, they can still take some root damage if it gets down to 10 degrees like it's supposed to tonight. So all I do for some of these is I rake a bunch of leaves on top of them. That's it. Pile them all together as closely as you can get, rake a bunch of leaves on top, and that snow we're supposed to get. We're supposed to get over 12 inches of snow, and that should actually give them some more insulation. You know, piling it up so when the wind is 10 degrees and it's really cold, it's not going to kill the roots on the outer edge of the plant pots. The rest of the video was shot yesterday, and today we're getting that big snowstorm. And right now we're getting a ton of sleet. But all the snow will actually help protect these plants and thigs. And if you didn't do anything to protect them, you can even at this point just kind of pile up some snow around them a bit, give them a little bit of protection. That plant there that's not protected at all, the first 5 or 6 inches of it will be covered in snow, and that'll protect the bottom part. But I'm glad I don't have to do any more of this work, because it's a pain in the butt sometimes. And it may or may not be necessary depending on how cold you get and the varieties you're growing and the types of plants you're growing. But I like to do it just to ensure that I preserve some of the wood on the trees to start them out a bit higher next year rather than grow them back from the ground. Yeah, we should be getting probably another inch or two of sleet on top of the 5 or 6 inches of snow we got. And that should be fine for all these. And that will actually help protect them. I think Thursday we're supposed to get down to 7 or 8 degrees. And that's a temperature that I'd like to have most of them have some sort of protection for. And this snow will actually help that. So if you get a bunch of snow around your trees, don't shovel them out. And if you don't have anything around your trees, you can throw extra snow on them and pile it up. And that would actually help rather than hurt them. They don't mind freezing. They don't like 5 degrees, 0 degrees, all that stuff. The sleet is actually starting to hurt right now. All protected and covered in 5 or 6 inches of snow right now. And we're getting some sleet. But all of the winter protection I spent my time doing will definitely help some of these maintain some of their branches above ground when they might not have otherwise. Not necessary, but in my case I like to do it. Even though it's so cold out. Some of the snowdrifts have piled up to cover almost the entire thing. Especially those ones that I did that were just the bucket. But they all look pretty good. Let's see, some of them there. I got 1 leader sticking out, and that's okay. This one here you almost can't see anymore. This is what the river looks like now, and it's going to get much more frozen over the next couple days. It's cold out here. video was just to show an example of some of the different winter protection methods I use for my figs, my mulberries, and a couple other different trees and some of my potted plants. Some of them may not be necessary depending on how cold you get. In some areas north of us, you may need a lot more than I did here. But any questions you have about winter protection or anything you're curious about, just ask me in the comments. Okay, stay warm.